Okay, well, thank you, first of all, for that very interesting presentation. If I may, I'll start with a few more questions around UBO. I think, we've known for a long time that understanding who you're really doing business with and where the risk really lies is key in fighting financial crime. I hope that we get some questions from the audience as well. So I think we may have some mics circulating. Please put up your hand if you've got any questions for Mr. Mansour. I think, as you pointed out, it can be quite complex to establish who the beneficial owner is. For the benefit of the people in the room, where I think we've got various degrees of experience, what are some of the telltale signs that people are trying to hide beneficial ownership? What are the sort of things they should be looking out for when they're doing their due diligence?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that this is something that shouldn't be anything new to you, because I always say knowing your client is not an AML requirement. This should have existed and been with you all the way along. This is a core professional banking practice. If you don't know who's your client, really, you cannot do sensible business with the guy. So if you don't know who is your client, what's his business, what's his family, you can't really extend your services to the client and really do a very good business with them. So I would say knowing the client is, first of all and foremost, it's a professional banking practice. Now came into the picture AML, so that gave it another perspective on further verification. But really knowing the client and who is your client is really, to me, it's innate with the banking practice.
There's been a lot in the press about the use of shell companies. You mentioned nominees.
Yeah.
Obviously, nominees can sometimes be people with no relationship to the individual. Sometimes they can be family members, etc. One of the things that has created quite a lot of press attention in the UK recently is the role of accountants and solicitors in establishing and corporate foundation companies in setting up some of these structures. And FATF has been focusing on DFMPBs for quite some period of time. Do you think enough is being done in that space at the moment with regards to applying the regulation and enforcement?
Yeah, I think quite some advancement has been done in this regard, specifically with the accountants and notaries, not as much as with lawyers, because just mentioned the legal professional privilege. But yeah, there are quite some inroads and progress done in this regard. The issue is the legal professional privilege, and this is how issue advanced in Europe, is totally protected when the lawyer is acting as representing his client in a certain litigation. But when the lawyer is engaged in rendering services to his client, like forming a company, like advising on tax issues, like any kind of advisory capacity, then this does not necessarily fall strictly within the legal professional privilege. Because the legal professional privilege is something that is explained to us, that this is connected with human rights, and this is enshrined in the UN Declaration on Human Rights, where everybody has the right to protect himself. And if you want to protect yourself, you have every single right to use anything to protect yourself, including the use of a lawyer. So you have to confide to your lawyers everything that you have in order for the lawyer to be most empowered and informed of your situation that would help him to bring a very good case. So if this kind of a legal professional privilege or this kind of a trust in between an individual and his lawyer is breached, then that will deprive the individual from really exercising his right to protect himself. So that's perfectly okay within a kind of litigation that affects the person. But when you are in a kind of another situation, forming a company, getting into a transaction, a contract, that is not necessarily the human rights kind of thing. So that's a situation where on the AML, we would need some transparency. And this is where the legal profession privilege would not apply. But still, in certain jurisdictions, they're not making distinction, and the legal profession privilege is upheld against total transparency.
Yes. Yeah.
So lawyers are still, in certain jurisdictions, yes, the kind of like hampering the progress towards more transparency.
Mm-hmm. And do you think enough is being done by countries to ensure that, you know, accountants and company formation agencies and lawyers understand their obligations under AML?
I think this is, we're just really, quite some work has been done, but we are really at the beginning.
Yeah.
Because on this work with the professionals, accountants and notaries, it really started seriously just a few years back. But on beneficial ownership, I'd like to draw the attention to a pretty important driving force as well. And that is the Global Forum on Taxation. Now, the Global Forum is another kind of international body which promotes and fosters transparency for the purpose of tax declaration, tax collection. And the Global Forum is also a body which was formed by the OECD, the same higher body that formed the FATF. So they are under the same umbrella. And the Global Forum on Taxation and the exchange of information on taxation uses the same definition of beneficial ownership like FATF. In fact, in their own documentation, they're saying we are using the same standards and the same definition that the FATF is using, and we will refer to the results of the FATF work on this regard. So if there is any kind of a breakdown or kind of weaknesses in the system, they would readily use it that the country on tax declaration and tax information exchange is not complying. So there are two driving forces now. It's that the FATF on one hand for the fighting money laundering and terrorism financing, and there is the Global Forum which is working to promote more transparency on tax issues and the exchange of information cross-border to ensure that the individuals are declaring their proper taxes. And this is really what gives the beneficial ownership concept and the transparency requirement a much higher level and trust. Because the Global Forum multi-agreement also went into force, I think, beginning different countries, different situation, but really beginning of 2018, you would have started to countries would have needed to disclose all the bank accounts of individuals who are residing, tax residing in other jurisdictions. So this is also a new development and a new driving force on the beneficial ownership.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, actually. The sort of, if we like, coming together of attempts to avoid tax evasion and to fight money laundering. And of course, I guess criminals are not necessarily known for filling in their tax returns every year, are they? So we've got that conjunction. One of the things you talked about in your presentation was this clash between privacy and transparency. Certainly as Refinitiv, we spent a lot of time last year talking to the various authorities in Europe as the GDPR was being implemented. And in fact, we helped write some of the clauses in the UK legislation to ensure that there was sufficient room for banks and other obliged entities to comply with the regulation. But I'm interested in whether you think there's enough dialogue between the privacy regulators and the financial regulators at the moment. It seems to me that they often don't speak to each other and they don't quite understand each other's challenges at the end of the day.
Right. I mean, for a long time, the standards were developed within the closed walls of the FATF meetings, and the private sector was not really there. However, since a few years, there are certain specific workshops that would involve the private sector, and this is on an increasing trend. Now, reaching out to the private sector is a kind of increasing, as I said, a trend to exchange ideas, exchange views, and that is on more than one issue, because definitely you need the input of the private sector whenever you're developing policies or statements. And I think this is pretty wise, because together the regulators and the private sector, when they work together, the work would be more effective, and the results would be more usable. That would also cut the need to amend many times based on practical experiences, because you will be getting the input of the private sector up front and really integrating it in the standards right away. So I think the reaching out to private sector is an increasing trend, but it's a bit tricky, because the private sector is not one body. We're talking about the financial sector, but there are other bodies that could be involved, and to organize it is not easy. Sometimes there is some kind of a talk that the FATF is inviting the private sector at a time. Maybe it needs to develop more dialogue with other bodies that are directly involved in the money laundering, like the judicial and the law enforcement. So that's also needs more work together, because some standards affect the judicial body and some affect the law enforcement, and sometimes the standards are developed that with these bodies not around in the room.
Yeah.
Of course, the individual members would be each reaching out to these bodies within their own jurisdiction. When coming to the meeting, they would have the input of these bodies, but it's much better sometimes having this face-to-face kind of interaction that would really refine the standards to a better and higher level.
Yeah. I certainly agree with you that I think more dialogue between the private sector, public sector, FATF, and other organizations that are involved in the wider landscape would be helpful at the end of the day, because I think it is about the design of the policies. It's very difficult to change things once you're implementing them if you've got a clash in regimes at the end of the day. One of the things that Refinitiv have been focusing on is greater public-private data sharing. I think we probably would all agree that fighting financial crime is about information ultimately. It's about transparency, but it's also about being able to share that information in a more efficient manner between the bodies involved in that. Are you seeing some positive trends in that respect in your conversations at FATF and in the job that you do at the FIU?
I would like to say that probably the Australians and to some extent the UK, they pioneered this kind of a idea for PPP, and there was quite some work and workshop and illustrations about how they went about it. It's about getting together the relevant agencies like the FIU, the banking community, law enforcement, and other relevant agencies into one room actually to look into a case, and that would cut down immensely on the time which is needed to coordinate whenever you're working on the case. Because now, whenever you work on the case, it's a sequential kind of a relationship. the AML regime, as you probably know, works pretty much in a sequential way, like the FIU receives a suspicious report. The FIU would do its part in analyzing and looking into the work. And then if the suspicion is elevated at the level of the FIU following its work, it would disseminate to the judicial or law enforcement to carry on the work. And this kind of a chain and flow of work is definitely time consuming. When you get all the relevant authorities in one room working on the case and sharing information at the same time, surely it cuts the time and gets to some kind of results much quicker. But that's again, and it's very challenging because it's a matter of local laws and legislations, if they allow it, because when the relevant agencies are sitting together, they're actually sharing live data together, they're having access to each other data, and sometimes in certain jurisdiction, having access to such information which is available mainly to the private sector, really at an early stage is a no-no. Yeah. And that's why this kind of experience of experiment, though it is continuing in Australia, in the UK, and in GIMLET, it is not taking a lot of traction elsewhere, mainly because of legislative and local and domestic laws. So I think this is all about the FATF, that the standards, if you read the standards, they're pretty wide in order to be able to absorb and contain the different laws and jurisdictions around the world. So the experience is out there, and a lot of people know about it. We have, in the Egmont, conducted several sessions on that to know, and the Australians were out there and talking about it in many ways. And last time it was in Sydney in September. And but it's still there. Yeah. I don't see it really moving faster because of, as I said, the local legislation in certain countries that would not allow it to be done the same way the Australians and the UK are carrying it out. So it's pretty much left to each country to develop its own PPP when we're talking about investigations, financial investigations. But there could be public-private kind of a dialogue to develop standards and to look at cases. That's another issue. Okay. So the pretty well say when we talk about PPP in the ML and specifically in the Egmont group, we're talking about really the PPP in investigative cases. Yeah. It's not the same as maybe some would perceive it, not to develop typologies, not to develop any kind of understanding of certain issues, which are still there, and we can still do it. Like now what we're doing, and my being here, and I say except to be and speak, is I find it as a chance really to network and to bring such issues that we've been talking about for quite some time to the private sector, raise the awareness, and really give them this kind of a lead that they can follow through on their own and follow the subject in other kind of summits or meetings, because this is pretty important going forward. The beneficial ownership in KYC is really at the heart and core of the initiative to fight money laundering and terrorism financing.
I certainly know in the UK that the GIMLET initiative, I think, has delivered success, undoubtedly. I think it's also helped to improve the SAR reporting regime in terms of the quality of SARs that are reported. Again, is that something that at Egmont and FATF is a conversation, just the quality of the information that's being presented?
I think, the quality of the SARs or STRs is pretty important, and I think this is left to every kind of jurisdiction. Like in my jurisdiction, we are currently running workshops with the banking community, and specifically on writing and reporting STRs. And this is to raise the proficiency and when, how, and how to really when to report, how to report, and really raise the quality of the reporting. And this is really of utmost importance because it really starts there. That's the starting point. We work on the basis, the whole AML regime works on the basis of reporting. There's a pretty known kind of statement that the FIUs, basically, which are central, and this regime do not go into kind of fishing expeditions. That's FIUs or certain supervisors that have the power to supervise. When supervise AML compliance, they're going to the institutions to check if they have the right systems and procedures in place to be compliant. They're not going there to search for all their accounts or any group of accounts to find if there are any kind of problems there. It stops there, no fishing expeditions. So the whole regime rests on reporting. It's up to you, compliance officers and the private sector, that you are working daily and you are all the time witnessing or say monitoring the transactions, that you are able to spot those suspicious transactions or those suspicious accounts at reporting. That's the lead. That's the lead that you give to the FIU to trigger a certain investigation and really a case. So this is pretty important. And in many money center and world-class kind of banking sectors, now they have, apart from the compliance in the bank, they have their own FIU. There is an FIU within the bank. And this is very important because on one hand, it would really investigate and validate the suspicion, which is raised by the compliance, and really gather more information that helps the FIU and law enforcement really bringing a case finally to a successful conclusion in a shorter period of time, and really raises the quality of the reporting, because not every trigger should be by the system should be reported. There should be some work done and some information gathering and validation before it is reported. And this is a growing trend among the larger financial institutions in the world. So STR and the reporting function per se is really of paramount importance because it starts there.
I'd like to thank Mr. Mansour both for his presentation and for sharing his thoughts from the stage. Thank you.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.